R Gary Patterson is a native Tennessean with a passion for rock and roll. He is the Fox Mulder of rock and roll history. Okay, just like he is. And since this, so how you doing there? Are you gonna be able to do this? I mean, are you chilled out enough to be able to handle this? I know.
I am very excited. Well, anyone that knows me knows how much I love the Beatles, and I had heard the story a few years before I read his first book, actually. His first book was called The Walrus Was Paul, The Great
Right.
Beatle Death Clues in 1969. And I read it the year it was published, and it's my favorite story, so I'm very, very excited about this interview.
Yeah, I am too. Every time I heard this guy talk on Coast, that's the only time I've ever heard him talk. Was I'd always fall asleep, and I can remember Ian Punnett interviewing him. He was one of the people that interviewed him, I think. Maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to give this man a call, and I'm calling.
And you're
So
going.
yeah, well,
If I say one ringy dingy, am I going to get bit for plagiarism?
busy.
Um, it says he is online.
It's yeah.
Let me see if I can add him. I know you guys were connected earlier. Oh, wait. Okay, it's gone through. Let's see. Hello?
I have to be the one to call him for this to work.
No,
Hello,
hi, Gary?
Oh,
Mr.
yeah,
Gary.
it's me.
Oh, perfect. You're breaking up just a little at the beginning.
Okay. Do you want me audio or
Yeah.
do you
No,
need
this is
visual?
fine. This is fine. We're good to go right now. We just did the news and gave you a bit of an introduction. I mentioned your first book, The Walrus Was Paul, which is going to be the highlight of tonight's interview. But you also wrote Hellhounds on Their Trails,
I
Tales
did.
from the Rock and Roll Graveyard,
I did.
and then you did. I don't know. Would you consider it a follow-up book?
Take a walk on the dark side. Rock and roll myths, legends, and curses.
Yeah, it's kind of updated and expands on the previous book where you talk about, the musicians waiting at the crossroads to sell their soul and
Dying
and
at
then
the age of 27. All of that.
the
Holy
Curse of 27.
curse.
Yeah. But today, and it's funny, I wanted to do this interview and we had to look for a Wednesday, and it just so happened that November the 9th was the 50-year
Yeah.
anniversary. And then for some reason it just occurred to me, oh yeah, and it's Wednesday again.
It is. How
Wednesday
about that?
morning at 5 o'clock, yeah.
Wednesday,
So now, when
at
was the
6
first?
o'clock. Yeah.
Sorry, you were breaking up a little.
Wednesday morning at 6 o'clock as the day begins.
Now, when did you first hear this story?
Well, actually, I heard it when I was just out of high school, and I heard it on radio, and it became an obsession to turn to as many radio stations as possible and see what you could find out. At first, I thought it was just, hoax, just something that, this was just too strange. But growing up I guess you would say, into a culture with the assassination of John Kennedy, which was in 63, and then in 68, which was the year before the rumors came out, you had the deaths and the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. So we lived in a culture that this was very believable. There was no internet, and television didn't cover it. There may have been maybe 30 seconds to a minute of something on it on television. Later, I found that F. Lee Bailey had done at least a 1-hour television show on this, where he confronted people from Apple to tell the truth about what happened to Paul McCartney. Now, that was later, and of course, in those days, we didn't have cable TV, so you had three channels, NBC, CBS, and ABC. And where I live in the South, we didn't have the show. So eventually, when I wrote the book, I got a cassette tape of the show with F. Lee Bailey. And it was interesting, to say the least, listening to Peter Asher be interviewed and some of the others. And of course, when you take a look at it, you had Russ Gibb on the show also. And I know that Fred Labor, who came up with the description of the Abbey Road cover, he was on the show, and he told me that F. Lee Bailey, before he came on, he asked him, he said, "Look, is this real?" And he said, "No, it's only a hoax." He said, "Okay." And he walked out and they did the show. So I have a cassette of that show that someone set with a cassette recorder to record it, and it's got this incredible 60 cycle hum on it. So I do have the show. So that's interesting. So that was done, but that's when I heard about it. And then I started trying to read everything I could find about it. And I remember Life magazine actually came out with an article, and the clue was so funny because it came out in November, and Life came out once a week. And when it came out, it was on the exact anniversary of the car crash, which I thought was interesting. And as it came out, they they actually had on the cover, they had "Paul is still with us," and it was a picture of Paul McCartney, Linda, and two of his children, and he's waving at the camera. But people who were into the conspiracy noticed that on the back of the magazine cover there was a car ad, and if you held it up to the light, the car ad cut off Paul McCartney's head, which was supposed to be the whole rumor that he blew his mind out in a car, and that the rumor came out that he'd been decapitated in a car crash. So all of that was fine, and that happened in '69. It continued till the Life magazine article came out in November. Everyone took a sigh of relief, and that ended it. And then it comes back again, because when I wrote my book, The Walrus Was Paul, I wanted to take the reader into the psychology of the entire period, so that if they were there and they were hearing it for the first time, then this is how they would react. So that's why I guess the scope of the book does that. It's sort of like opening your eyes for the first time, and it's in a chronology, which actually starts back a little further till 1966. And of course, when Sgt. Pepper's came out, it was such a revolutionary album, not to say less than Revolver, because Revolver was probably the first major move into psychedelia by the Beatles, and Sgt. Pepper's followed up on it. One of the more interesting things about the Beatles is I think the Beatles destroyed themselves by how creative they were, because after they did Revolver and they went into Sgt. Pepper's, it's like that was a wall that they hit as far as creativity with sounds, with backward tracks. And then when you get to the White Album, you get to the idea, well, this is the way that they were guitars, bass, and drums. So they're going back to the simplistic idea. But they did do, of course, Let It Be, but Abbey Road was released last. And it was probably one of the greatest Beatle albums. I always remember listening to the second side, and when they end with, and in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. What more could you say, right? And that
Best
was in
line ever.
'69.
No, best line ever. No, I totally agree. I mean, everything you said. I mean, there's so much to the story. I guess for people that don't know, maybe this is their first time, what happened 50 years ago today?
Well, I think what we take a look at is how the Beatles' music changed. You take a look at I Want to Hold Your Hand and She Loves You, and then it goes up to, it starts to really get a little different. When you do, Rubber Soul was a little different, but when you get to Revolver, it was the first psychedelic album the Beatles did, and actually Revolver's my favorite album, followed by Abbey Road. So those are my two favorite. But a lot of people started to notice that when the Sgt. Pepper's album came out, the Beatles were different. The music was different. There wasn't any more "I Want to Hold Your Hand." I mean, we were doing songs like "Within You, Without You." The Far Eastern concepts of music and scales and instruments that were on the album really gave people something to listen to. So that changed, and people started wondering why. And then they noticed the cover of Sgt. Pepper's, and they noticed you had a set of the Beatles in the wax museum figures looking down at this grave, except for John Lennon, who was looking to his left. And then you see the Beatles dressed up in their psychedelic finery, their silk marching band robes, satin, I should say. And, they were different. And then if you look, you saw the word Beatles in red hyacinth flowers, and it looked like a grave. And you saw the word Lonely Hearts Club Band, which was in the center. And of course, the Beatles had two bass drums designed for that cover. And the only thing they had that was similar was the phrase Lonely Hearts Club and the way the fonts looked on the bass drum. Also, if you studied the making of Sgt. Pepper's, you'll notice that Peter Blake designed the entire artwork except for the bass drum that was designed by an Australian maker of fairground posters whose name was Joe Epgrave. Now, when I discovered that Joe Epgrave, I noticed that Ep and grave was very much like epitaph engraved. And of course, an epitaph is found on a tombstone. If you look at the cover, you see the word Beatles in red hyacinth flowers, and hyacinths are the flowers of the underworld in Greek mythology. It also doesn't say the Beatles, it just says Beatles. And that could be that some of the Beatles were there. Now, some people notice that if you look to the far left side of the album cover where it says Beatles in red hyacinth, you can see a number 3, and it says 3 Beatles, but of course we know there's 4. You also see the yellow hyacinth flowers that are in contrast to the red, and the yellow hyacinth flowers makes out a bass guitar. And the reason it makes out a bass guitar is it has 3 black strings. And of course we know that a bass guitar has 4 strings, as the Beatles had 4 members. But if you notice, the guitar has 3 black strings, which means one's missing. So you get the idea, the concept of the hyacinth flowers. You get the idea of the bass drum that says Lonely Hearts. And then you see the Beatles in their band outfits, and Paul McCartney standing in the center playing a black oboe with his fingers making the number 3. And then there's a hand over his head that at least picks him out of the group. Life magazine came up with an article saying an open hand over a person's head was a representative of early death, or whatever that means. And the hyacinth flowers in the underworld, whatever that means. But if it is a grave scene, the bass drum would have to be the drum skin or the tombstone. A tombstone would tell you who died and the date of death. And the Sgt. Pepper's cover tells you that. Now, in 1969, none of this existed. No one knew anything about the bass drum. No one knew about the funeral scene. They just noticed a hand was over McCartney's head that picked him out of the crowd. When you turn the album cover on the back, McCartney has his back to the camera, and the rumor was that there were plastic surgery scars on his face, and that's why he turned his back to the camera. Of course, if you research it, you find the figure who had his back to the camera may have been Mal Evans, who was one of the Beatles roadies and one of the people who went on the tour. So that was one thing that was interesting, as you look at it. So anyway, we look at the drum skin. On the cover of Sgt. Pepper's, if you look, you'll notice that in the crowd is Lewis Carroll. And Lewis Carroll was John Lennon's, favorite author. You had Carroll, who wrote Alice Adventures Through the Looking Glass. Now, if you take what Lewis Carroll he advises you to do. Take a looking glass to find the wonderland. You take the mirror and you place it in the center of the phrase lonely hearts. And once you place it in the center of lonely hearts, it spells out a cryptic message. Now you have to have a straight edge mirror. You just can't put it in a regular mirror and look at it. But if you put it in a straight edge mirror, lonely hearts gives you a cryptic clue. And if you start to the left, you get a numeral 1, I, and then ONE, which spells one again, and then IX, which is numeral 9, and then it says he die. And between he and die is a diamond-shaped arrow that points straight up to Paul McCartney and down to the grave. Now, the first thing I thought about in Great Britain, of course, if you take a look at 119 he died, the very first thing I thought was, okay, one of the Beatles, again, with a number 9, McCartney has 9 letters, he died. But if it's going to be a funeral scene, you have to have the date of death. Now, in Great Britain, of course, 119 would be interpreted as September 11th, right? And I was on Coast to Coast one night, and we were doing some of the clues, and I noticed, well, isn't it odd that on 9/11 you have 2 sets of Beatles like the Twin Towers? And I was going over how a lot of people they sort of look maybe a little too much into some of this, but it was just something I was doing for fun. But if you take a look at what the entire thing is, then what you have is not 9/11, but 11/9, because the 2 ones make 11, 2 ones. And on November 9th, which is our anniversary today, Amanda, we would have a date of an accident, November 9th. Now, if you look on the back of Sgt. Pepper's, it was the first time that lyrics were ever published on an album cover. The back of the cover is blood red. Like I said, McCartney has his back to the camera, but notice George Harrison, who's standing to the right of McCartney, and he's pointing with his thumb straight up to the first line of the song She's Leaving Home, which says Wednesday morning at 5 o'clock as the day begins. Now, when the Beatles were pasted onto the album cover, the lyrics appeared next. So if George is pointing with his thumb, then he had to know the line he was pointing to. Now, November 9th, 1966 was a Wednesday. In 3 different Beatle magazines and articles, books that came out between 66 and 67, there's a mention of a car accident Paul McCartney had at 5 o'clock in the morning. So you look back on your calendar, November 9th, 1966 was a Wednesday. The accident occurred at 5 o'clock. And today, we're on the 50th anniversary of maybe the day Paul McCartney was killed and replaced by an imposter.
A lot of people think so. A lot of people think it might be a publicity stunt, and if so, it went horribly wrong. But what happened, like the story that we know so far, on November 9th, 1966, was Paul not supposed to be at John's house after John met Yoko Ono? Again, on the 9th.
Well,
the 9th revolves around his whole life.
Very good, because on November 9th, 1966 was the exact date that John Lennon met Yoko Ono. And November 9th, 1961 was the exact day that the Beatles were discovered by Brian Epstein in the cavern. So you take 1961, of course, John Lennon was convinced that the number 9 had so much meaning for him that you take 61, you add 9 to it, that's 1970. That was the year the Beatles broke up. 1971 was the year that John and Yoko left England to come to the United States, to New York. Eventually they settled into the Dakota. But if you take 1971, you add 9 to that, that's 1980, the year that John Lennon was murdered. Their apartment at the Dakota was 27, which made 9. The address to Dakota was West 72nd Street, which makes 9. John Lennon was shot at the entrance of the Dakota. They took him to Roosevelt Hospital. Roosevelt has 9 letters. The name of the hospital, the address is 9th Avenue. And John was pronounced officially dead at 11:07, which would be 7 plus 1 plus 1 is 9. And considering he was born in Liverpool with 9 letters, at 6:30 p.m., 6 plus 3 is 9. So you have the idea that how John was basically controlled by the number 9, or he believed it so seriously. And of course, the Quarrymen has 9 letters. The Beatles were not formed until Paul McCartney met John Lennon. McCartney, the only Beatles with 9 letters. And I mean, Bill Harry, good friend of mine, who was John Lennon's best friend, he can go through pages of the number 9 symbolism and numerology with John Lennon and the Beatles. And even when, the video game with the Beatles came out, it came out on September 9th, 1999, I think. Mm-hmm. So all those were 9s. So if we take a look at it and we try to figure out, was it a publicity stunt? It would have been something in order of they would have to come out and let you know something was there so you could look for it. Now, in 1969, when the rumors came out, the reason I call my book The Walrus Was Paul is from a line in Glass Onion where John Lennon sings, "Here's another clue for you all." Now, the rumor in 69 was the word walrus was supposed to be Greek for corpse. And that wasn't true because the rumors came out in 3 levels. At first, you have the totally ridiculous. An example of that is going back to the Help album and saying, oh, Paul McCartney doesn't have a hat. He's the only Beatle without a hat. Mm-hmm. So therefore, it's a death clue. Well, that's totally ridiculous. Number 2, you have guided looking and guided listening. So let's take a look. The most famous clue that really got people into this was on Strawberry Fields Forever. You remember what John Lennon is supposed to say at the fade out of Strawberry Fields Forever?
I always hear, "I buried Paul."
Right. I hear that too. So let's take a look.
"I'm very bored" is a close second. "Cranberry sauce," I don't hear it at all.
Well, Derek Taylor said that he was in the studio and John Lennon said, "I'm very bored." And then John Lennon says, "I said, cranberry sauce." Well, here's what you do. I guarantee you, if you played that now, the listeners could hear all 3. If we started it and I said, I want you to listen because you're going to hear I buried Paul, then everyone's going to hear it. Mm-hmm. And then if we say, well, now listen again, and now you're going to hear "I'm very bored," and I would say it that way, people would hear it. They would hear it as well. And then you could actually hear cranberry sauce. I've got to admit that on the anthology album that came out, you can hear cranberry sauce much closer on the anthology than you can on the actual recording that came out, but you can hear all 3. Mm-hmm. Now on those, I call guided listening. If you want to take a look at guided looking, take a look at the yellow hyacinth flower bass guitar and see if it spells out Paul question mark. Because a lot of people can see that the yellow flower guitar spells out Paul with a big question mark at the end of it. You may not be able to see it, but if I go and I point it out to you, then you will be able to see it.
I totally agree. Just for the listeners to know, if you go to our Facebook page on Black Swamp Radio, I actually posted all these pictures of all the albums and the pictures that I knew would come up tonight, so you can take a look and see what we're talking about.
Well, look at you, Amanda. You're already ahead of the game.
I'm trying to be.
Now, let me ask you a question. You enjoy this. When did you come up with the idea that this was a fascinating study and that you got into the Paul is Dead thing? Because I would say you're a little younger than I am.
Well, yeah, I grew up listening to, what we'd consider now the oldies, but, classic music from the 50s and 60s, and always liked the Beatles. But I remember so distinctly in elementary school I was in grade 7, and the grade 8 class had someone come in and tell this story about how Paul had died and the clues were there and whatnot. But all I knew was during the lunch break, all these students came out and they were crying and they were saying, you'll never believe what we heard. And I had to know more. And
Sure.
It was at the same time that my music teacher, had told us about some guy in the 60s dropping LSD and playing the Beatles records backwards, and, that this book had been published on the crime. So I had bought the White Album and read Helter Skelter at the same time. So I was hooked ever since then, and I saw the presentation myself, and I mean, there's just so much, and you just never know. I mean, again, you can say maybe you don't really hear I Buried Paul, or maybe you can't really see the left-handed bass spelling Paul with the question mark, but I mean, some of the clues, like, why was Paul standing with his back to the camera on Sgt. Pepper's?
Sure.
And you can say it's Mal Evans, but you can see alternate versions where Paul's standing sideways. So you can make out his face, and it's definitely him, but he is going towards putting his back to the camera. And it's more the explanations that they try to brush off, like in the Magical Mystery Tour, which they said it was their first kind of failure. It was released, Boxing Day in 68, 67, 68, and everyone hated it. It's probably my favorite album. I like everything about it, and it was maybe one of the last times the Beatles were the Beatles before all the ugliness, so I'm sentimental with that album, but
Yeah.
there were hand-drawn things that weren't in the movie. There was a picture of, like, a diner scene, or like at tables, that wasn't in the movie, and you turn it sideways and it's a skull.
Oh,
and
you see the lady's beret.
Yeah.
It makes the left eye socket.
Yes, exactly. And like they wrote down all the titles of the songs, and under I'm the Walrus, in brackets, it says, "No, you're not," said Little Nicola. But that line's not in the movie. So is it that the subtitle of the song? Is that the full title of the song? Like, why? And then during Your Mother Should Know, John, George, and Ringo are all wearing red roses, and Paul's wearing a black one, which is weird. Why did Paul get it? Why not John? Maybe because Paul was singing the song, but the explanation was, why is Paul wearing a black rose? And they said, we ran out of red ones. Well, then no one gets a flower, or only Paul gets one red flower because he's singing. Like, the explanations just seem so flimsy, and and enter Charles Manson. I think, and I think you agree that if Charles Manson said, I heard these messages about someone dying and death and this and that, and he misconstrued it to serve his own purposes, what are they going to say? Yeah, we were talking about death, but we were pretending we buried Paul because he died, and it was just a joke. Sorry. I mean, what do you do? But and there lies the problem. So what do you do with that?
Well, that's what makes it probably the second greatest urban legend in rock history.
Second greatest.
And we go back, what would be earlier? I mean, I think greatest, but when I wrote the book, I wasn't aware of a guy named Robert Johnson, who many believe sold his soul at the Crossroads. And that's probably the one that got it started, because it influenced so many people, as far as Eric Clapton, as far as Keith Richards and Jimmy Page. So since that occurred in 1938, as a rock historian, I said, okay, I might tip that off. But the most popular, the one that lasts forever, the one that's probably the most fun, the one that will send cold chills up your spine, that's Paul is Dead. And that's exactly what we're talking about. And of course, Magical Mystery Tour was basically songs left over from Sgt. Pepper's.
Mm-hmm.
And when we take a look at Strawberry Fields Forever, well, that was recorded for Sergeant Pepper's, and it came out on Magical Mystery Tour. But there's so many fun things. If you listen to A Day in the Life, if you listen to the line where John Lennon sings, he blew his mind out in a car. He had noticed the lights had changed. The people stood and stared. They'd seen his face before. Nobody was sure if he was from the House of Lords, right? That's what the lyric says.
Mm-hmm.
But if you listen to it, I swear, you'll hear John Lennon sing, nobody was sure if he was from the house of, and he goes into falsetto and says, Paul, Paul. And when you hear that, you're wondering, well, is this in the first two categories? Is this just something that I'm trying to make fit with a sledgehammer or a round peg into a square hole? Or did the Beatles actually plant things themselves? Well, I believe the Beatles actually planted a few things. Now, I know that a lot of them are totally ridiculous, but there are some, like the bass drum, they had to plant it. And the idea of Lonely Hearts, that was brilliant, but somebody really didn't get credit for it. So as a historian, I know that Mal Evans suggested they call the album Lonely Hearts Club. Now, was that to give the clue? It had to be. I mean, it had to be. And when John Lennon sings Here's Another Clue for You All, that implies that there were clues on other albums.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when the Beatles came out with the anthology, I have a friend from ABC Radio who interviewed Paul McCartney, and he called me. He said he admitted it. Well, he sent me an audio clip where Paul McCartney says, well, it became a bit of a game in the old Beatle days to put hidden things in. Well, we all know they put other hidden things in, like on Girl and some of the others.
Mm-hmm.
But if he implied that they had actually put hidden messages in, then there had to be a reason why that they came up with this whole Paul is dead thing. But then it became odd that if the clues were planted in 1967, why did it take 2 years to find out about the clues? When some guy called Russ Gibb, who I have interviewed, and I've got him in the Wall versus Paul on the Simon and Schuster version, that he called him and said, what's this about Paul being dead and all? And then you have Russ Gibb going over it. Now, I was lucky enough, this is kind of funny, I had been, I don't know, I was a consultant for a Russian film on Paul is Dead. And they went to England, and they went to Abbey Road Studios, and they actually brought flowers to Jane Asher, who was Paul's girlfriend, who supposedly walked off the picture at the back of the Abbey Road cover.
The girl in the blue dress, yeah.
Yeah, and they came to the United States, and we went to Dearborn, Michigan, and we spent 3 days with Russ Gibb. And we talked to Russ Gibb, filmed Russ Gibb, and I asked Russ, he was talking about, getting the call and being in Detroit and doing the show, and how he had the LeGrand ballroom that he was running, and how the Beatles had called him angry because, there was a hysteria that started. And then the Beatles realized they had made so much money that when Paul McCartney came to Dearborn, Michigan, he asked for Russ, he gave him some free tickets. But all he got out of it, the Capitol Records gave him copies of the Beatle albums from the first to the end. And he laughed about that. So they seemed to make money off the whole hysteria. So I thought that was interesting. And Russ is a great guy. But let me tell you, Russ had no idea about the bass drum clue with a mirror. He had never seen it. So he didn't know how close he was to figuring this out. So now we got two directions, right? Did he really die? Or was it a hoax? What do you believe?
Well, That's one thing I always tried to steer clear of my own personal opinion, because let people fight amongst themselves. But it's just it see, that's another thing that really struck me was, if the accident was in 66 and the clues started in 67, there was a lot of controversy, even who called the station and why. Some say maybe it was John putting on a fake voice. Maybe an Apple employee was told, okay, now's the time to release these clues. But a lot of people claim it was just a listener that I'm thinking he accidentally flipped the White Album backwards, because didn't he say he heard something about Paul is a dead man, or Turn Me On Dead Man, or something like that? It seemed like, and then he started looking at Abbey Road. But I mean, no one even mentioned Sgt. Pepper until they started looking back. So
Right.
like, what, who broke it, and why like that, and why then?
Well, see, that's a great answer, because one of the things is that this mysterious caller just called in. Now, I will tell you that I have met this caller,
Really?
and I interviewed him. And in the Walrus was Paul, the Simon Schuster edition, I actually have an interview where he tells me where he heard about the rumors, how he called Russ Gibb, and all this that happened. So he made himself known to me, and how the rumors spread. Now, there's a number of things about rumors. I mean, Terry Knott goes to England. He's from Detroit. He became the manager of Grand Funk Railroad. He comes back, and there's a number of songs that release, like Brother Paul, by a group called the Paul Bears, Paulbears. And so you have that, and then you have the concept that maybe he came back from England and had heard this, and he did the song. So if he was fed any information, unfortunately he's passed away now, but if he was fed any information from Abbey Road Studios in London, he came back, that would be one of the great clues. So we look at that. We look at the idea, was it programmed? Was it something that was set in motion? And were the Beatles ready for it? So it still gets back to the idea, did he die? Now, I'm going to tell you what I think. I normally, when I did my book, I leave it open-ended. And mainly I leave it open-ended because it's basically the idea that I want a whole new generation to get caught up in the wonder of it.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's the only time you're going to see this. I mean, there have been other artists who people have claimed have been killed in accidents. I guess the latest one I remember was a country singer whose name was Travis Tritt. It actually got so big they had to make an announcement at the concert that was supposed to be within 2 days that he wasn't killed, but it never caught on. And you got to remember, there was no internet in 1969. Imagine what would happen if there was an internet where you could research all this. The only information you could get was from radio. There was one magazine that came out that went through a lot of the clues. So that was one thing you wanted to go through. So you have that. So let's take a look. Why 66? Well, it couldn't be before because the Beatles were on tour. They were performing, and it would have been almost impossible to get a guy in as an imposter, teach him all the songs on bass, and go out and play those shows. So it had to be during the recording of Abbey Road. Well, what happened during that recording? We know that there was an article in Beatles Monthly where a rumor started that Paul McCartney had been killed on the M1 motorway right outside London in icy road conditions, and that the Beatles management at Abbey Road had actually called Paul McCartney at his home on St. John's Wood to ask if he was all right. And he said, well, yeah, I'm fine. I don't understand what's going on. And he said, well, there's hysteria. Well, this only occurred in England. It didn't come to the United States. But could that have set off a chain of events where McCartney realized, people think I was dead? What if we started I don't know. What if we started a gag? Let's say that Sgt. Pepper's comes out. The music is totally different. It's not She Loves You, I Love, I Want to Hold Your Hand. It's different. What if the album doesn't sell? Well, what if we put clues on the album that if the album didn't sell, that people would buy the album to look for the clues? So in that case, it would be a great marketing feat, like you would agree with me.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if it's a gag or a hoax, the thing that bothers me about the hoax is it's only good if you know that it's there. Mm-hmm. The Beatles have never announced that it was a gag. Now, there were some close references, like in the song Back Off Boogaloo, where Ringo Starr says, "Wake up, meathead, don't forget that you were dead." That was the idea that McCartney had created that, and the rumor was that the word boogaloo was the code name the other three Beatles gave to McCartney. And of course, that was in the sue me, sue you stages, where, Eastman had actually protected McCartney, and the other Beatles had gone against it with Alan Klein. So you have that idea. So there was some references, or like in John Lennon, How Do You Sleep, where he says, "Those freaks was right when they said you were dead." Well, that was a reference to McCartney. So you have some after references that would say that. So perhaps you could look at it the way that Sgt. Pepper was so trend-setting that the Beatles were afraid that their fans may not get it. And of course, after Sgt. Pepper, it all changed back again. And of course, keeping in mind that Magical Mystery Tour was, part of the Sgt. Pepper sessions. So, they went back to the guitars, and then, of course, they went into Phil Spector on, when they did Let It Be, and then they came back to George Martin, and they really went out on top with Abbey Road. So you have those. Now, how lucky would the Beatles be? Let's say it was real. Let's say on November 9th, 1966 at 5 o'clock, 50 years from today, at 6 o'clock in the morning, that Paul McCartney had left Abbey Road Studios after a major argument with Ringo, because he always kept recording Ringo's drum parts, for instance, on the White Album, that McCartney was killed in a car accident. How lucky would the Beatles have been to have found an imposter? Someone, Philip Shears, for instance, was the name that was given. In other words, or the idea of Billy Shears. Philip Shears was his father, according to the legend. And William Campbell, the other name, which would be Bill. And they announced Billy Shears on Sgt. Pepper's on the first song. How lucky would the Beatles have been to have found a person who looked very much like Paul McCartney, may have had a little bit of plastic surgery to make him look better, but who could sing, play the bass left-handed, and become an incredible songwriter? Because let's take a look at it. Before 1966, what great songs had McCartney written? Well, he was part of I Want to Hold Your Hand, She Loves You, there's And I Love Her.
Yesterday.
All those are great songs. And then, of course, Yesterday is the one you were going to mention, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's take a look at what Paul McCartney had written from 1967 on. All right, the first thing that hits me is I loved Helter Skelter.
Me too.
And, so let's say that the imposter wrote Helter Skelter. And then let's say that the imposter, Paul, wrote the entire second side of Abbey Road. That's pretty impressive. And then let's say, I'm not patting him on the back for wings, because, I'm not being mean or anything. And I'm sorry, Paul, if you're listening. But, I heard someone tell me if you played biker like an icon backwards, It actually says, I really wish I was dead. But if you listen to Live and Let Die, that's a great song. And Wings have had some great songs. I mean, I'm listening to Maybe I'm Amazed. What a fabulous song. So, wouldn't you think that the fake Paul who came out in 67 was actually a better songwriter than the actual Paul?
Well,
I mean,
see, there's theories about that though, because like you even said, after 66, they stopped touring and they started, more with the double tracking, and I don't think many people realize the major cut in Strawberry Fields where it's two totally different versions of the song just spliced together. And
let me stop you right here, Amanda. You are very knowledgeable.
thank you.
Yes, and I am very impressed because you're right. How many people know that John Lennon recorded 2 sessions on Strawberry Fields, and he tells George Martin he likes certain parts on this side, certain parts on this one. Let's blend them together. So here they are blending 2 different songs with 2 different speeds. Exactly right. And also,
and it's seamlessly too.
yeah, it's perfect. And the other thing is this: how many people know that Sgt. Pepper was cut on a 4-track recorder? You had 4 tracks. Today you have multiple digital tracks. But Sgt. Pepper was done only on 4 tracks. And everything before that was done on 3 tracks or 2 tracks. So the White Album came out, you had 8-track recordings, and Abbey Road was cut on 8 tracks. And, to me, that's amazing. And, of course, that's a pat on the back to George Martin because he was able to actually do this. Listen to this story. I haven't told this one. I was in London a few years ago. I think it was 2013. And every time I go to London, the first place I go is Abbey Road. And I've been in the studio, in Studio 2, so I've been lucky there. But I was with a group of other people that brought over, and we'd gone to Buckingham Palace. And the tour guide knew that I was a Beatle author, so she gets with me and lets me know that her grandfather played the piccolo trumpet part on Penny Lane.
Wow, what are the chances?
She gave you his name, it all matched out. And she told me that he came home and told her grandmother, she said, well, I went in and I recorded this part with a group called the Beatles. Have you ever heard of a group called the Beatles? Well, Penny Lane Magical Mystery Tour at that session. And he was the piccolo trumpet player. I thought, wow, what a great story is that? Because Paul McCartney had gone and heard an orchestra, he heard the instrument, and he tells George Martin, I would like to have that instrument on Penny Lane. So it was up to George Martin to do the arrangement and bring in the musicians. So what a great story, huh?
That's an amazing story. See, when you said Buckingham Palace, I figured she was going to say, oh, that's the bathroom they smoked a joint in or something.
No, it's just a small place that you would meet somebody who has such a memorable part in a great Beatles song.
That's incredible. That's a really good story. Thank you for sharing. Oh my God, you heard it here first, everyone.
You did. I saved that for you, Amanda.
Thank you. But see, I mean, there's so much. I'm a little sidetracked right now. Okay. Where were we? Okay. Oh yes. Okay. About Paul being such a brilliant songwriter. Could a replacement have been even better? Well, if they went from touring to being just studio musicians, how do we know that John and George weren't writing the songs? Because after the Beatles broke up, George's first effort was a triple album, and he was the first Beatle to have a #1. But he's my favorite, so I'm biased. But I mean, he could have very easily written. I mean, you take songs like "While My Guitar Gently Weeps," "Something," "Here Comes the Sun." He could have easily.
Well, and you're right, because I mean, George was coming into his own as a songwriter, and when the Beatles first started, they gave him 1 song on every album, and none of those songs were actually released until they did Abbey Road, and they they went with Something. And of course, at that time, George was pretty well dated on it because, they want to put my song out now. And of course, the funny thing is that Frank Sinatra was doing the song one night, and he said that he thought it was the greatest love song, that had been recorded in the last 30 years. And he gave credit to Lennon and McCartney. Of course, that was pretty bad for George.
It's been devastating.
Devastating. And I was talking to Steve Lukather, if you remember, from Toto, the guitar player, and he was telling me when he met George Harrison that he told George, he said, "George, my favorite guitar solo you've ever done was Taxman off Revolver." And George said, "That was Paul." And so another devastation. But you're right. You take a look at especially John. Could John have covered it? And I know there have been sonograms on voices that say that Paul's voice had changed. And, I look at that and I sit there and I go, well, sometimes your voice does change because you become hoarse. Listen, I saw McCartney play a couple of years ago in Nashville, and he played for 3 hours. I've heard tapes of him trying to hit those notes on Maybe I'm Amazed. He gets older, it's harder to hit. And I know that Life magazine actually had a voice graph of McCartney singing Hey Jude, and Yesterday, and the voice didn't match. So you look at that, and I know that there have been pictures showing that McCartney's height was different, that his facial features were different. I know that we'll probably talk about that. And I get a phone call, and it's from Coast to Coast, and they say, "Hey, Gary, you got to see this. This guy has photographic evidence that McCartney is an imposter." Well, I looked at it and I thought it was interesting. So what I did is I went to a friend of mine who had just graduated in forensics for the TBI, Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, and had studied at the Body Farm. And when you talk about Dr. Bass at the Body Farm, I mean, he's the guy who did the autopsy on the Big Bopper. I mean, this is as high as you get, right? And I said, let's go over these pictures. And what I found was a lot of the pictures, they were given in good conscience. But when you do a photograph on an album cover, you stretch the pictures. So sometimes the head doesn't look like it matches, or the eyes are too far apart. So this person assured me that, it was how the photographs were placed in there. So, I follow every lead as we go with it. So let's take a look. In 1966, do you know why the Beatles stopped playing live?
My guess would be death threats over the Maureen Cleave's interview, I believe, about being bigger than God, and the KKK was after Ringo. They thought he was Jewish, and all the big mass Beatle burnings, books and shirts and records. And
let me stop you right there and say you're exactly on the right path. When the Beatles played Memphis on their second tour, John Lennon got a note saying that he would be shot at 9 o'clock that night. Well, when John knew the number 9, that terrified him. So when they were playing in Memphis, someone lit a string of firecrackers and threw them off, and they heard the firecrackers go off, and the Beatles started looking at each other to see who had been shot. When they went to the Philippines, I had a friend whose name was Alf Bicknell, who was with the Beatles, who was their chauffeur, who was one of their roadies and one of their agents that went with them. And he told me the whole story, that when they got to the Philippines, they were supposed to play a benefit for the Marcus family. Imelda Marcus, who had shoes like probably not as many as you do, Amanda, but she had tons of shoes. And the Beatles refused to get into the political thing. They didn't go to the show. Well, there was a program on Philippine television of all these orphans crying and Miss Marcus crying, and then you had the Philippine army coming after the Beatles. Well, they had to run. And Alf told me that John Lennon turned to him and he said, "Alf," he said, "there's many things that we can learn from the Filipinos." He said, "but right now, it's let's get the hell out of here. And they ran to the airport. And when they got to the airport, they were blocked. Paul McCartney ran first, got on the plane, and when John ran, he tripped, and they were beating him. And Alf threw his body over John, so John could get up and run to the plane, and Alf had injuries after that. And I know that especially he had a terrible knee injury that unfortunately he passed away before he had surgery. And when they got on the plane to leave, they announced they wanted to see Brian Epstein and Mal Evans outside of the plane. Mal Evans turns to Alf Becknell and he says, Alf, he says, tell my wife I love her. Mm-hmm. Because he was convinced that they were going to be shot and killed. And when they left the plane, they had a briefcase filled with money that the Beatles had made when they played the Philippines. They took their money. And when they got on the plane and they flew off, George Harrison turned to the others and he said, you know, it's not fun being a Beatle anymore. Mm-hmm. So when they landed in England, to stop all this madness that they had to go through, they decided that they would spend their time in the studio, they would perfect their craft, that they would do great albums. So when you had Revolver, which was being recorded at the time, and they did some of the songs off Revolver, the next album was Sgt. Pepper's. And to me, as a historian and a major Beatle fan, as you, I can honestly say that the Beatles actually destroyed themselves by their own creativity because their fans always wanted to push them further. You know, well, you did Sgt. Pepper's. What more can we expect? You got to keep going. You got to keep going. And it burned them out because how can you, I mean, I don't know if a group today has ever surpassed Sgt. Pepper's. Do you?
Nothing even close, in my opinion.
You know, I mean, I know, and I do these shows, and first of all, I got to tell you, I love being in Toronto when I was there October 15th. Had a lot of great, a lot of great fans, a lot of great friends that were there. But, you know, when I think about this, and I'm not trying to be saying, well, you know, you can't get better than 1967. We have a lot of great bands. You know, people ask me, well, who are your favorite bands? Well, you know, I always have some. I mean, I love the Foo Fighters. I mean, there's stuff like that, but I've never heard anybody progress like the Beatles did. If you take a look at the creativity when you go into Rubber Soul, and then you go into Revolver, and then you go into Sgt. Pepper's. All right, you go into the White Album, and I agree with George Martin. The White Album would have been a great single album. I know they had some different songs like Wild Honey Pie and some of the others they stuck there. And, you know, Let It Be had some good songs, but what a masterpiece Abbey Road was. When they came back to George Martin, they said, okay, let's do it right. So the Beatles became studio players where they were able to experiment with all these different sounds, backward tracks. I mean, I love the story how they did Revolution number 9. Now, I will bet you that if you take every Beatle fan that we know in Canada, the United States, Europe, wherever, and you ask them what's your least favorite Beatles song, I guarantee it'll be Revolution 9. Would you agree with me?
If they even consider that a song, if they even think about it.
Laughing.
They skip it so often.
Yeah, that one, and probably the second would be You Know My Name, Look Up the Number, right?
I like that one.
Yeah, it's kind of cute how they change it around. But Revolution number 9 is a series of numbers, you know, just backward sounds, tapes, you know, everything. And they go in the studio and they cut these lengths of tape, they throw them up in the air, they pick them up in a random order, they splice it together, each one holds an eraser to a tape head, and they play it. Some of it's backwards, some of it's forward, you know. But when you listen to that, it's filler on the album because they got out of their deal with Capitol. Well, Revolution 9 was one of the great clues of the Beatles, you know. When you have the test engineer who says number 9, 13 times, then, you know, the first thing you think, number 9, is that November 9th? Is it McCartney? He has 9 letters. And when you turn it backwards, you hear him say, Turn Me On, Dead Man. And when you hear that over and over again, it gives you a chill down your spine. Also, in the track, you hear John Lennon say, "So all right, Paul, then we'd better go and see a surgeon." That was supposedly what was heard. You can also hear him say, "So the wife called, and we'd better go and see a surgeon." Or, as some people hear, "He hit a pole. We'd better go and see a surgeon." So you hear that. And then you hear a car accident backwards. You hear flames. You hear a voice screaming, "Let me out! Let me out! Get me out!" You hear that. And then you hear sort of a requiem mass going on behind it, and it's chilling. I mean, I remember sitting in my dorm room playing that backwards on an album when you actually had a turntable that you could play backwards. So all of that happened, and I thought, wow, this was a great way to listen to this. It was really amazing. And that was off the White Album. And of course, earlier you mentioned exactly how Charles Manson got into it, and that was a White Album thing. So when we take a look at all this, I mean, Sgt. Pepper's, Revolution 9, all of this came out, and it was hidden there. No one ever played a record backwards. The Beatles were the first band to ever have a backward track on a song. And of course, that was Rain. And when you listen to Rain, and you listen, which is, I got to tell you, it's one of my favorite Beatles songs.
Very underrated, I think.
Yeah, very underrated. And actually, I'll have to give Ringo credit. I think it's the best song of Ringo's drumming. It's fabulous, the way he does the drums on that. I think also I read one somewhere that Ringo says it was his favorite Beatles song. But when you listen to the third verse, it sounds like John Lennon is chanting. He's saying something like, "Scaramouche, not yeah," like that. And I thought,
that's
oh my
a really
God.
good impression. You nailed it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And when you reverse it, you hear John Lennon saying, "When the rain comes, they run and hide their heads." So they just turned the track backwards. John had taken the track home. He had smoked a little marijuana, laying on the floor, played it, and he turned the tape backwards, and he thought it sounded so cool, so he goes in and he says, "We need to play this backwards." So George Martin spun the reel when they got to the third verse, and that's what we hear. So I think it was cool that the Beatles were able to use backward tracks, backward guitar tracks. Listen to Tomorrow Never Knows. And also when we talk about Tomorrow Never Knows, we talk about 8 days a week, we're talking about song titles that Ringo suggested. What a great idea. Tomorrow Never Knows. Ringo came up with that. But you hear that weird sound that George Martin got, and how many bands could capture that sound? How many bands tried to jump in and play the psychedelic game with the Beatles and George Martin? Look at the Rolling Stones, Her Majesty's Satanic Request. I mean, I have a new appreciation for the album, She's a Rainbow and all that, but when I listen to it, it's nowhere near the craftsmanship of Sgt. Pepper's. And of course, I love it. If you have Her Majesty's Satanic Request, if you look in the hedges, you can see the Beatles images there, because the Beatles had put "Welcome the Rolling Stones" on Sgt. Pepper's. The Stones return the request when they do the other. So I think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah,
but it was
sweet.
a fascinating time to have been around in 1967, 1968.
Well, and you're saying like it didn't compare to other things other people were doing at the time. I think it's almost other people didn't even consider doing things like that. I mean, if you couldn't make the noise with a guitar naturally, it wasn't included on an album. Like, who included chains in a bathtub for sound effects for Yellow Submarine, and like who, and I mean it was an accident that John flipped the end of Rain backwards and included that, but I heard people were actually taking the White Album back, saying my record is defective, this last song is all warped.
Right.
Because it was the first time they had ever heard something called distortion on a guitar
Right.
before.
Mm-hmm.
But I also heard that the the Queen wrote a letter to the Beatles saying how much she enjoyed that particular song. So, it depends on how hip you are, I guess. But, I mean, and you say things like, some of the obvious ones, Paul standing with his back on the back of Sgt. Pepper's and the One Black Flower and stuff. But you're right. Some of these things, like, John came up with it maybe from Alice Through the Looking Glass, where you cut the Sgt. Pepper drum in half to get the date. But unless someone told you, like, how would you ever figure that out? Like, that's kind of why I think maybe there was more behind it than just a fan calling in. But apparently you can do the same thing on the Magical Mystery Tour, where it says tour on the front. Mm-hmm. If you cut that in half, it makes the word look.
Right.
And then even George Martin, when him and his son remastered some of the Beatles songs for Cirque du Soleil with the Love album, if you cut the word love in half, it says code. And right. I mean, that album was only released, in the last 10, 15 years. So the story's still going on. It didn't really just stop at Abbey Road. Like you said, John mentioning it in How Do You Sleep, and Ringo
right.
mentioning in Back Up Blue Glue. But, Paul picked the name Wings for his next album and walked barefoot across Abbey Road on Paul Is Live with...
Exactly.
People thought it was Martha the sheepdog, but it was another imposter on Abbey Road. It was his son James's sheepdog, and like Life is a Bowl of Cherries, where all the cherries are outside of the bowl, and
which is life is empty, right?
Yeah, and I even found we mentioned when the anthology was released in the late '90s, they had a music video for an unfinished song John was working on, "Free as a Bird," and
right.
you can see so many different images are references to other Beatles song titles, and there's one that would represent a day in the life where there's a car accident, white Aston Martin, and if you look in slow motion, there's like a black van, like I guess that would take bodies away. You can actually see an image of Paul McCartney's face in the back window.
Exactly.
So people are still doing it. So
look at the license plate on the Aston Martin convert on the car that crashed in the scene. Did you notice the license plate?
In the Free as a Bird video?
Yeah.
Was it LMW28IF? Or was there a new number because he had aged?
What it is a clue. It's YFE7, which implied 7 wives between all the members. And you have a fire engine that's sitting there with the firemen in a line. When I did the book, I did on the Simon & Schuster version, I go through all 90 clues on Free as a Bird. There's over 90 of them.
Oh, I don't know if I have that version.
And when it ends, you hear of the mandolin player or the ukulele player, George Formby, say, "Turned out nice again." But if you listen to it, it's reverse, and it says, "My name's John Lennon." My name's John Lennon. And, I mean, it's just really odd. So, when the Beatles put it together, if you get the Simon & Schuster version, I did all the clues, every little one, and including that, the fire engine that's clean, just, it was amazing how the Beatles had put that there. Now, I was tipped off to it by ABC Radio that they were going to do that. And so I had the opportunity to go through and write down all the clues, and I thought that made it kind of interesting because it's so much fun, and it's really good for a lot of Beatle fans like you and I, that if we ever went to a party, we would play that with other Beatle fans and see how many clues we could pick out. I mean, I can look at it and I can see all of those. I mean, Penny Lane's there. I mean, it's amazing how much time they put into it. So I know they enjoyed it. And also there was a Simpsons show where Lisa wanted to become a vegetarian. So she goes and speaks to Paul and Linda, and Paul tells her, he says, if you play Maybe I'm Amazed backwards, it's a ripping recipe for lentil soup. Well, at the end of that episode, I was taping it because I knew McCartney and Linda were going to be on it. And when I taped it, I could hear this voice go, bleep, 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 as they were playing Maybe I'm Amazed. And I said, oh my gosh, they got a backward track. So when you reverse it, you hear Paul McCartney say, take 1 clove of garlic, and he goes through this entire recipe of lentil soup. And this was on The Simpsons. So does he still have fun with this? I think he does. Like you said, Paul is live, walking across the Abbey Road cover. He's wearing a suit that was made, I think maybe it was Macmillan, who did their suits in 1966. He's leading the sheepdog, which his name is Arrow. It's his son's, like you said, not Martha. And of course, the license plate says 51 is.
Yes.
So he has a wonderful time doing that. Now, we can go over the whole thing, and I'm sitting here thinking, man, I saw McCartney played 3 hours about a year ago, nonstop, never had a drink of water, sounded fabulous. I mean, some of his range, he doesn't hit the high stuff as well, but, it's Paul McCartney. I mean, when I listen to it, I get into this a lot because what I do is this is what I research. And I love the great stories. And I think that when we take a look at what urban myths are, I think it's great for a new generation to pick up on it. And I've always been very impressed when I've done shows at Beatle Fest and Beatle conventions across the country that I notice that you've got kids 9, 10, 11 years old. They've all got Beatle t-shirts on, and they all know the lyrics. So the music lasts forever. And I think that's the great thing. And I think that's the great thing about rock and roll. Even if Jim Morrison's dead, we can listen to him on Sirius XM radio or on CD, and he's there like Elvis and everyone else. And I think that if you're a rock star, it's like Greek mythology. That they're too powerful just to die as ordinary men and women. That there has to be a special thing for them. And wow, what a great thing to say about the music and the culture and the lives they've touched and how much they mean to us, right?
I totally agree. I've actually heard comparisons on kind of the Greek mythology of the legend and how that ties into the Paul is Dead story too. They're walking the way the sun rises to the way it sets in the funeral procession on Abbey Road, and the hero dies young but is resurrected as a god. And I mean, there's so many angles, and of course you have Aleister Crowley on the Sgt. Pepper cover, and rumors that maybe John Lennon had sold his soul to the devil for a record deal, and they are dressed up as magicians, 4 or 5 magicians, again, pointing out, is there another Beatle? There's and that's what's so brilliant about it. Like, you can believe he did die and they replaced him. You can believe it was publicity gone wrong thanks to Manson. Was it all witchcraft? Was Paul the sacrifice? Like, was he the sacrifice that gave them the fame? Or, was John Lennon's time up in 1980? And that's how it all fell apart. I mean, there's just, to think it's just publicity, but to have so many angles to one story that people didn't even know about for years. It was right in front of them, and they didn't even.
Right under your nose. I mean, when you look at the Sgt. Pepper's album, you see Edgar Allan Poe. Okay. Now, when you look at Poe, you think of the premature burial. That's a little gag on that, but you also think of the Purloined Letter, and that was the first detective story. And the idea is that the clue was always under your nose. Well, all the clues are under your nose. And let me also pat you on the back, Amanda, because you know how to pronounce the name Crowley, because most people pronounce it Aleister Crowley. And if you look on the top row on the left, I think it's the third figure, you can see Aleister Crowley. If you look closely, his head is shaved. A lot of people seem to see 3 6s because he called himself the Great Beast. His mother gave him that title. And he's on the left-hand path. If you look on the right side of the Beatles cover, they have all the gurus, all the light figures are on the right. So you have the left-hand path, you have the right. Now, when Kenneth Anger went to England, he realized, as a member of the Church of Satan and a follower of Aleister Crowley, that there was power in rock concerts, especially the Rolling Stones. So when he went to England in '66, he met Lennon, he met Mick Jagger. He influenced them because he told great stories about Aleister Crowley. Now, the Stones actually became involved with the movie Invocation of My Demon Brother. And Jimmy Page and Led Zeppelin became involved with Lucifer Rising, or actually Page. So you have that idea of the Crowleyism that came in '66. Now, the Beatles had the picture, but they never, and of course, if you're really going to look at the line, it was 20 years ago today, Sgt. Pepper taught the band to play. If you take 67, you subtract 20 years, it's 47. That was the year Crowley died. And Crowley was looked upon as a magician, and magic with a K was something that could really be practiced. But if you were walking across Canterbury Street in London in '67, you would see people dressed up as wizards, you'd see people dressed up in cowboy suits, and you had this idea of the occult that was brought in because you had people looking for answers. If it was metaphysics, I mean, listen to the Beatles. They were into the far eastern sounds of the sitar, and they'd gone into the Maharishi, and all of this was in '67. So people were looking for answers. And Kenneth Anger from California, the film director, brought over a lot of the Crowley stories, and that's where all that infested. And of course, Charles Manson was into the Crowleyisms also. And when we go to the White Album, I know that you might want to talk about, how Charles Manson became involved in this. And maybe it was the right time when we're talking about '69 when the Death Clues started, but look at what Manson had done in California. And were the Beatles talking to him? I mean, Manson believed that the Beatles were actually contacting him to start a racial apocalypse that he called Helter Skelter.
Yeah, well, he said Honey Pie was directly, explaining, sorry, I'm really busy. You have to come to us. You have to kind of take charge. We have.
Sail across the Atlantic, fill me with the magic of your Hollywood song. And of course, that's where Manson was living. And he took Revolution number 9 and based it on the King James Version of the Bible of Revelation 9, where 4 angels would rise from the bottomless pit. They would have long hair as women and wear breastplates of iron, which Manson interpreted as electric guitars. And they were waiting for the 5th angel to join them to start the apocalypse. And the 5th angel's name was Apollyon, and that was who Manson believed he was. And he thought the Beatles were trying to get in touch with him to start Helter Skelter. And the week before the murders took place, Charles Manson and his followers had called the Beatles' offices in London. Now, I believe that when the Clues came out in '69, that Charles Manson's interpretation of the Beatles' White Album terrified John Lennon and Paul McCartney. Because what if they had been subpoenaed to come to LA and say, well, yeah, we try to put some hidden messages in to make people think Paul was dead, but we really didn't mean anything to Charles Manson. I mean, it would be a nightmare, especially since Manson's followers, when they did the murders, they wrote lyrics from the White Album, on walls and refrigerators, like Arise and Blackbird and Helter Skelter, all of these things. So, it would be a nightmare, psychologically, financially, everything for the Beatles. And plus, I think the Beatles in '69, as they were about to break up, they weren't very, cordial to each other as much as you would think. So why not just let it die and not say anything about the rumors at all? And of course, I'm really glad. Well, there's 2 things I can look at. First of all, I'm glad that the legend continues, because to me it's like Beowulf. I mean, it's like coming of age, listening to a great story, getting into it for a whole new generation, so they can share it. And you have no idea how many emails I get or how many people hit my website saying, I've got I'm doing this as a research paper, and I like to know. I mean, I love to hear that as a former teacher. And I also remember that when this happened, there were lots of research papers written on this. This was kind of interesting. And when I wrote The Walrus's Paul, I kind of wrote it as a tongue-in-cheek look of a research paper with it. I sort of got that idea together. But the whole idea that it lives for generation and generation, that's how it should be. You agree?
I agree. I'm sorry, my Skype dropped out, so I missed the beginning, but I am back now. I do apologize.
No problem.
No, well, I think you basically knew where I was going anyway from what I did hear. That's where I was going. But I just find it interesting that in between songs on records, the grooves are supposed to be empty. And when we were talking about Blackbird, in between Blackbird and I'm So Tired, there's gibberish in those supposedly empty tracks. And that was actually deliberate backmasking, saying Paul is a dead man, miss him, miss him, miss him. So it's interesting that, of all the songs that he said he was influenced by, they would use a term from a song that actually had deliberate backmasking. Do you think he kind of knew the Beatles were up to something and figured, I can do what I want, and kind of used them as an alibi because no one would ever believe I brainwashed people based on something the Beatles told me in songs, and it backfired on him? Or
I think it's kind of interesting that Manson had his own interpretation. If he wanted to be a rock star, which he did, and he wanted to be a Maharishi of his family when these people came in to showcase his psychic abilities, his ability to see into things, that this would have been a great story to make believers of his family. Because when he went through Revolution number 9, it was very believable. They listened to it, and they were supportive. But what really turned Manson into what he was when they were involved with the Wilsons, Dennis, and Troy Fleming comes in, not Troy Fleming, excuse me, Terry Melcher, who was their producer, and Terry Melcher says, yeah, you have talent, I'll do an album with you. And then Charles Manson's excited, and then he listens to the song Cease to Exist as Cease to Resist by the Beach Boys, where they took his song and they changed it, and it infuriated him. He didn't get the record deal, and he found the house on Celio Drive that Terry Melcher had with Mark Lindsay from Paul Revere and the Raiders, and it was just lucky for Terry Melcher that he was not there the night that they did the murders, because it was to pay him off. And Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys, the drummer, Brian and Carl's brother, received a bullet in the mail that they were after him, and he was terrified. So you had this whole family that goes out and does the murders. Now, Bobby Vasilier, who was actually the role of Lucifer in Lucifer Rising, was involved in the Gary Hinman murders. And a lot of people take a look at Charles Manson and they think that he did the murders only to replicate the Henson murders so that Bobby Vasilier would be released from jail. So you have that. It was a pretty callous time in 1969. And when you take a look at, how hippies were looked at as flower children, peace, love, and all this, the whole idea of the whole concept of hippies and the summer of love completely changed, because it ended the whole movement, because now you have these people who were hideous, who committed murders. So I think that had one thing to do with it as well as with Charles Manson and the concept with the Beatles and taking on their music. That was one thing that was disastrous as far as the Beatles would go if they looked at it. And of course, the Beatles had no mention to Charles Manson. None of this was actually true. It was how Manson looked at it. And sometimes, we have people who have an idea of looking into things. Like in the 80s, you remember when Backward Tracks really came out?
With
Judas
Priest
Dan
allegations.
Yeah. Dan Rather comes on CBS and he says there are satanic messages in rock songs.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, Stairway to Heaven became the big one. And everybody was hearing Backward Tracks. And, it was kind of funny because to me it was like taking paint and throwing it on a wall. And you just throw it there and walk out. But then you have someone come in and they say, oh my gosh, look at that. It's sacrificing children. Well, sometimes the horror is in the seer and not the person who just did the art creation. And that was one thing. I mean, I've always thought about that, but the Beatles led with that. That was one of the things. So, the whole idea of Backward Tracks, we thank the Beatles. It was innocent, but, whether it was a great game, a great quest about Paul is dead, or if it was accidental, as in Styx and the Stairway to Heaven, we'll never know. But it's still a part of the great urban legend of rock and roll.
I couldn't agree more. And I mean, 50 years later to the day, and this might be the first time some people are hearing about it. Or, I mean, I've talked to people when I first started really hearing about this the first time myself. I was asking people, have you heard this? Have you heard this album? Have you heard this song? And then it brings people back, because, I don't think people can really appreciate, you see people carrying on at concerts today, and it's no big deal, no one bats an eye, but before the Beatles, when you went to a concert, you sat in chairs, and you politely clapped after each number, and I'm not a big fan, because he was mean to the Beatles, but
Sure.
Elvis basically, there were still segregated concerts and stuff, and black musicians weren't played on the radio, so to be hearing what they thought was new sounds, and the Beatles opened up things for England and just rock and roll and just so many things. And when you start thinking about all the firsts they did, not only a fade out to the song, but the first fade into a song. And, putting 2 4-track albums together to make an 8-track because they just wanted more, they wanted an orchestra on a rock and roll album. There's just so much. And when they first came out, I heard when they made their first movie, A Hard Day's Night, there was a scene at a concert at the end of the movie, and you can see all the girls screaming and crying and carrying on. And someone told one of the cameramen, go into the crowd and film the concert as if you were one of the fans watching. And 3 days later, he had to go to the dentist because the screams, the vibrations of the screams were so loud, they physically loosened his teeth. I mean,
it's amazing.
No matter how big you think a band is now, no matter how popular, no matter how loved, there's just no comparison. And then I can understand why the Beatles wanted to go to solo work as well, because they were using all these new sounds and new styles and everything like that. They couldn't hear each other standing side by side. Paul and George used to share a microphone. They were looking over at John to see what he was singing. Ringo was playing a completely different song, and no one knew. I mean, yeah. So I get it. I get it on so many levels, but I don't know. Just
you didn't have the monitors. They couldn't hear themselves because when the scream started, you're right, they had to look at each other. And I was too little to go see the Beatles because they didn't perform anywhere near me. They were in Memphis, which was about a 6-hour drive. But they did come to Atlanta, which was like a 3-hour drive from me. And I had friends who went, but when they went, they told me all they could hear was the screams of the girls. They couldn't even hear the Beatles perform. So I guess I'm glad I would love to have seen them, but I couldn't have heard them. That was
Yeah, exactly. It's almost like, and people that keep ticket stubs, it was just for the experience. It was just to see them because there's no way you would have heard them. But
and I have a friend whose name is Barry Tashin. I don't know if you know him, but he was in a group called Barry and the Remains. And he was the touring band with the Beatles on their second tour. And Barry and the Remains were a very good band, very talented. And they were on the Ed Sullivan Show, but they also were the backup band. So when the Shirelles played or they sang, they were the ones who played the backup music. And he actually wrote a diary of his time with the Beatles. And he always said that it started with a roar. When the Beatles came, you could hear a roar of sound from the audience. And of course, when they were out, everybody was very, nice and clapped their hands. But, when the Beatles came out to perform, it was a roar that he said he had never heard before. So it was always fun talking to him and finding out exactly, what it was like to be on tour with the Beatles. And great guy. But, just the idea of a phenomena that we'll never have. And I always tell people, there will never be another Beatles. And when I say that, people think like, I don't know about that. Wasn't Bon Jovi another Beatles? I remember when Slippery When Wet came out, and I had people tell me, Bon Jovi's going to be bigger than the Beatles. Well, you can't be. Now, I have a theory on this, and I'm going to tell you why no other band can be bigger than the Beatles. And the first thing is this. When the Beatles came out in '64 on the Ed Sullivan Show, we had 3 television networks, NBC, ABC, CBS. And when Ed Sullivan came out on Sunday nights, that was the major show. Today, we have hundreds of channels on cable TV. How could you get one network to pull in a band that a majority of Americans would watch on that one night, that would captivate all of the United States? Even Billy Graham stayed home to watch the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show. So I don't think anyone could pull in the viewing audience that the Beatles did when we have so many varieties today. And I think that's one reason why we can't. Now, I could always say, and this is always up to conjecture, is I don't think I've ever heard songwriters as good as Lennon and McCartney. And I mean, we have a lot of great writers today, a lot of great rock and roll. It's not, it's still going. But if you listen to the songs that Lennon and McCartney have written, that's, those guys will be always remembered as probably the greatest songwriters of pop culture in the 20th century. When you go to London and you go to the British Royal Library, they have actual manuscripts of Beowulf. I think there's one copy. The Canterbury Tales, all illuminated. You have the poetry of Wordsworth, John Keats, Shelley, Byron, all in their own handwriting. And guess what's right next to it? Handwritten Beatle lyrics.
Wow.
Now, is that not great company?
That is incredible. And that's the thing. Like, I know a lot of people, they say, I'm not really a big Beatle fan, but I like this band or I like that band. And I'm thinking,
sure.
Do you know how many bands would not have picked up a guitar if they hadn't heard and weren't they saying before the Beatles came out, rock and roll bands are on their way out?
Right. Guitar bands, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, and you mentioned you like the Foo Fighters. I'm pretty sure Dave Grohl is one of the biggest Beatle fans, Ringo fans. He is. Who's to say he would have ever picked up drumsticks if it wasn't for the Beatles? So,
and you're exactly right. Exactly.
But and I mean, everyone doesn't have to be a fanatical Beatle fanatic like me, but I mean, I mean, isn't Billy Joel, who is another brilliant songwriter, I think his biggest dream in life would be to be Paul McCartney. I think he said that in interviews. If he could do anything in the world, it would be Paul McCartney, you know? So, you know, and I don't think people appreciate that. But then the fun thing with this story is you can't look at the clues without hearing the music. Exactly. And then I think you truly appreciate how brilliant it is. And so someone took a lot of time to put this story together, like in the movie Yellow Submarine. Two submarines pass each other, and you see two distinct Pauls drawn in one submarine. Like, and it's not just for one frame, like, someone specifically put that in. And, you know, like, hand drawings of, in the Magical Mystery Tour booklet, there's one of Paul McCartney saying "The Fool on the Hill." And the way the L is, it cuts through his head to make a split in his head. And in the car accident, he was supposedly decapitated. So, and I mean, you say there's 90 references to Beatles songs in Free as a Bird, and I think there's 21 one-word title Beatles songs. What's the number to how many times a hand shows up over Paul's head? Whether it's drawn or looks accidental or full on staged. I mean, and how, like you said, the Life magazine saying the Paul is dead clues, you know, my death has been greatly exaggerated, and you see on the back is a car ad, and the car ad's going through the back of his head.
Exactly.
You know, in Strawberry Fields Forever, the music video, you can see a car going through the back of his head. On the Oldies album, a compilation album, you can see a car driving up the hill towards a Beatles head.
I'm glad you brought that one up. I'm glad you brought the Oldies album up because it was never released in the United States. When I did my research, I was pretty well sure the Beatles were doing this as sort of an American gag because I have friends in England who had not heard this. All right? And so the more I went with it, I kept saying, "You never heard this?" No. And then I had a DJ, James Well. I did his show in London. He said, "Well, Gary, you know, in England, we were much more Stones fans than we were Beatles." And I sort of thought about that for a while. But then, if you look at the Oldies album, like you said, there's a picture of McCartney or one of the Beatles. His face is shadowed. And if you go back to the only album cover that had shadows across the Beatles' faces, it was Meet the Beatles. And if you look at the front right corner of the album cover, that's where McCartney's picture was, with his face in shadows. There's a car about to crash into his head. And if you look at the bass drum that spells Oldies, you get OLDIES. And if you look at Arthur C. Clarke, who did the movie 2001 Space Odyssey, he created a killer computer system whose name was HAL, H-A-L. Well, it's code. Go to the next letter above H, A, and L, and you get IBM. That's your killer computer system. So the Beatles, who released their greatest hits, Oldies, look at O-L, the letter that comes after O is P, the letter that comes after L is M, and it spells dies. PM dies. And this came out right before Sgt. Pepper's. So, even though there's no Beatle on the cover, and that was probably by, you know, their idea of having someone that resembled a Beatle, the imposter, that came out the same time as right before Sgt. Pepper's, it shows the Beatles were working on that. So that's another great one, isn't it?
Yeah, I really like that one too. I mean, there's so much that people, you know, once you start, it just keeps unraveling and unraveling. Like, I can't remember what it's called, but I think Crowley was the one that said that put this into effect. But there's a certain way of like cursive writing. It's not an anagram. It's not that the letters are the same forwards and backwards, but when the handwriting is in cursive, you can actually flip it upside down and backwards to make the same image.
Right.
And Paul McCartney actually signs his name like that.
It's cool.
And I can't remember what the proper term is for it, but I mean, that's a lot of detail, and not
And
everyone may have read these things.
Yeah, so does Jimmy Page from Zeppelin. So, you have that, yeah.
Yeah, and then like splitting the bass drum. I think is probably the most brilliant clue ever, but you look at some of these things and it just shows their genius and the thought they put into everything, and it's still absolutely fascinating no matter what angle you look at, and
Well, it's just that what they've created besides their music is also ingenious. The way they put it in there, the way they've become such a major part of pop culture, and how bands have followed them. And, like for me, I'm a first generation Beatle fan. And I remember I was in elementary school when the Beatles first came out. I remember watching them on the Ed Sullivan Show on February 9th, 1964. So that shows you how young I was. But I did that. I grew up with them. I listened to the changes. I listened to the music. I loved it. Now, after the 70s, you had Wings and you had Lennon doing their solo stuff and George, and it was good, but it wasn't the same. Now, my daughter is a major Beatle fan. So when I think about this, the one thing that gets to me is I can't remember ever being a fan of my parents' music. I didn't grow up and say, hey, Mom, put on some Frank Sinatra or put on some big band music. It never appealed to me. But my daughter loves the Beatles. And I remember she has this huge picture of John Lennon hanging in her bedroom. And I'm sitting there thinking, it's great that you have a generation that picks up on the music of their parents or their grandparents or their great-grandparents, whatever, because it shows you how great the music is and how it affects different generations. And I've seen that with a bunch of kids, whether at Beatle Fest or whatever. So, it shows you just exactly how fabulous the music was and how it was picked up and carried on and put down, because that's the secret of rock and roll. Whether it's Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Robert Johnson, you take the music, you add something to it, and you set it down and wait for someone else to do it. Well, with my concept is that no one has ever touched where the Beatles set it down. And maybe that's what we're doing, Amanda. We're waiting for somebody to pick it back up and take it further. Well, we've been waiting a long time. And we've got some great bands, but nobody has ever taken it further. And maybe that's what we're waiting for, because when we hear that they're greater than the Beatles, well, we need to see it. Because there's a lot of great bands, but to be greater than the Beatles, what a compliment.
Yeah, I almost get offended when I hear, people say, oh, they're going to be greater than the Beatles, and then a few months later, you can't even remember the name of the band.
Yeah.
And you have to think, it wasn't like they had one really good album, I mean, they were putting out 2 solid, brilliant albums a year for almost a decade straight, and... and it wasn't just the compilations or a bunch of filler. I mean, I think their first album, Please Please Me, took 18 hours to write, record, put together, and release, and happened to come out the same day John F. Kennedy was assassinated.
Yeah.
Right? So again, it's a whole timing thing, and then, talking about eerie coincidences, the house that Terry Melcher used to live in that Charles Manson was aiming for was then occupied by Sharon Tate, who is married to Roman Polanski, who's a film director, who directed Mia Farrow in Rosemary's Baby, and it was filmed at the Dakota Buildings, where John later moved and was assassinated. So, I mean, what an odd string of events that connects all these people. And of course, Mia Farrow's sister, Prudence, was in India with them, meeting the Maharishi, and was the inspiration for Dear Prudence. And, you know, like you couldn't write a better story than that part. I mean, just how everything is interconnected and the timing, and John would have loved it too because of all the numerology connections for him and the
Sure.
you know, so, but I mean, and the accident was 50 years ago. The Beatles were going on for over 50 years now, and still it's still a topic that gets me so excited. The story, you know, the clues are there, take them as you want them. I mean, I didn't put up a picture of Paul with with the black rose. You know, those pictures are there. You can listen to these songs, hear what you want to hear, but these things were put in intentionally for a reason. We may never know, but you know, it's exciting. It's genius on every level, and
I agree.
I'm so honored that you took the time to be with us here tonight. I know you were just recently in Toronto a few weeks ago, which is my hometown. You said you were going to Vegas. Have you been there yet, or?
Not been to Vegas. I'll be on Coast to Coast, I think the 15th.
15.
Yeah, for a few hours. But let me tell you, I've done a lot of radio shows, and I've done a lot of things on the Beatles, and I've done a lot of things on Paul is Dead. But Amanda, I am very impressed with your knowledge. I can't think of a better place. I would rather spend the 50th anniversary of Paul is Dead than with someone as knowledgeable as you. And if you'll take a look, we're talking about all the strange clues and all the things that get you. One of the things that really gets me is on the Magical Mystery Tour album, there's a picture of John Lennon standing there with a walrus mustache,
Yes.
and there's a sign that next to him says the best way to go is by M&D-C. And it's supposed to be M&D Coach. And the Paul is Dead rumor was that he leaves at this time, but he never returns because you never see the return. But if you look at the picture, it always sends a chill up my spine because here's John Lennon standing next to a sign saying the best way to go is by MDC, the exact initials of Mark David Chapman. All right. Now, the Magical Mystery Tour album was released on December 8th, 1967, which was 13 years to the day that John Lennon was murdered by Mark David Chapman. I did a show with Coast to Coast. I think it was on Lennon's birthday with a good friend of mine, Richard Sirrett, who has a show in Canada. And we were talking about it, and there's a lot of people who would write me, and they would say, don't even mention his name, don't mention his name. And I understand why. Because obviously he killed John Lennon because he wanted the fame to go with it, as many killers do. But, you know, I have no doubt that Mark David Chapman will never get out of prison. And the strangest thing to me was that I had a dealer call me and offer me, well, he wanted me to help sell the Double Fantasy album that Mark David Chapman had John Lennon sign that night. And when the murder took place, Chapman put the album next to a flower arrangement. This bypasser picked it up, gave it to the police, and the album cover has fingerprint powder, all that on it, and also has a letter from the New York police chief authenticating that that was the album that was given to them that Chapman had Lennon sign that night. And even though Chapman wanted the album back, the passerby kept the album. Well, they sold it. And this person who owns it had contacted me asking me if I would broker that album. And as soon as he said that, I had the most incredible sick feeling that I didn't want to see it. I didn't want to touch it. And it's still out there for sale.
Well,
So when you take a look at that with the album cover and the idea that on the Magical Mystery Tour that it actually had predicted the assassin's initials and the actual date of death of John Lennon, to me, that's one of the strangest, sickest things that I've seen. So that's another one that goes with the Beatles.
I'm sorry
Yeah.
for the interruption, guys. Very good show. Thank you very much for being here, Mr. Patterson. It is that time. And the only question I have is, how do we get your book, sir?
Well, I tell you what, I have a web page. You can go to my site at rgarypatterson.com and check out some stuff. You can find me on Facebook as R Gary Patterson. I know Amanda's my friend there.
Mhm.
And the other thing is you can get my books at amazon.com. That would be the best thing. You can get it at amazon.com in the United States and amazon.com in Canada. So that's the easiest way to get them, and I've enjoyed my time with you guys tonight.
I had a wonderful time. Thank you again so very much.
Yeah.
You're very welcome, Amanda.
Great.
Okay.
You did very good, Amanda. I am very proud of you.
Thank you for letting me hijack your show, Arizona.
You didn't
I
hijack
really appreciate
anything.
it.
That was it's awesome. All right, I have to let you guys go. You can go ahead and talk between yourselves on here, I guess, if you want. But all right.
I'll disconnect so I don't interrupt your stream. Thanks again.
Okay, guys. You heard yourself a great show. Come back next week. We love doing this every single week. Have a good one. Be well. Be safe, everybody. And I will see you. Bye.